Hey there. Ready for a deep dive into something that feels super relevant to pretty much everything these days?
Tell me more.
Well, we're talking about our human tendency towards, short-sightedness, especially in a world that demands we think long-term about, well, huge things like climate change and AI.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's like we're always being pulled in so many different directions. The urgent always seems to crowd out the important.
Exactly. And that's where this book, Bina Venkataraman's The Optimist's Telescope, Thinking Ahead in a Reckless Age, comes in. It's going to be our guide for this deep dive.
Cool.
Have you had a chance to check it out yet?
Yeah, you know what I find interesting? It doesn't just, point fingers and say humans are terrible at foresight. It actually says we have a pretty remarkable capacity for it, especially compared to other species.
Okay, so we're capable of thinking ahead, but we don't always do it. Why is that? What's the deal with this short-sightedness thing?
Well, Venkataraman argues that we're constantly being lured by immediate gratification. It's like we're wired for the now,
Right.
which makes it so hard to, prioritize those really big, complex issues that need long-term solutions. She actually calls our current era the reckless age,
Okay.
basically a time where we're facing huge long-term problems, but keep getting stuck in short-term thinking.
That makes total sense. It's like, I know I should be saving for retirement, but that new phone is calling my name right now.
Exactly.
It's so easy to fall into that trap.
Yeah, and Venkataraman kicks off the book with a pretty relatable personal story. Yeah. It's about her contracting Lyme disease, you know it is, right?
Yeah.
She delayed seeing a doctor for a rash because, work and life were busy. And the result, a way more severe illness months later.
Ouch. That's a tough lesson. It really highlights how easily we prioritize the immediate over the important, even when it comes to our own health.
Right. And she connects that personal experience to this broader tendency we have, as humans,
Yeah.
to kind of downplay future risks.
Right.
She even uses some pretty dramatic historical examples to drive the point home.
Yeah, she talks about the destruction of Pompeii, which is mind-blowing because, they had earthquake warnings beforehand. It's like they knew something bad could happen, but didn't take it seriously enough to, actually change their behavior.
Totally. It's a classic example of that it won't happen to me mentality. Venkataraman brilliantly uses examples like Pompeii, Katrina, to illustrate how, even with warning signs, short-term focus can be disastrous. And it's not just ancient history either. Think about, the overuse of antibiotics. We know it's leading to superbugs.
Oh, for sure.
But the immediate convenience often outweighs the long-term risk.
I'm starting to feel a bit less guilty about my procrastination now. But seriously, if our brains are partly hardwired for this short-term focus, how do we even stand a chance?
Right. Well, here's the thing. It's not entirely our fault.
Oh, good.
Venkataraman dives into the psychology of why we struggle with long-term thinking. Our brains just aren't that great at fully grasping future scenarios.
Right.
And we're easily seduced by that dopamine hit of right now. It's like future consequences feel less real, even if they're potentially dire.
So it's like that saying, why put off until tomorrow what you can eat today, but maybe with slightly higher stakes than just an extra slice of cake.
Exactly. But don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. Venkataraman also explores some really compelling tools and strategies that can help us cultivate a more far-sighted perspective. Ready to hear about those?
Okay, this is where I need some help. It makes sense that our brains are wired for the short term, but how do we actually overcome that? What are some of these tools and strategies Venkataraman talks about?
Well, one technique that really stood out to me was this thing called perspective hindsight. It sounds kind of like a paradox, right?
It does. How can you have hindsight about something that hasn't happened yet?
Right. It's like looking back on the future. But that's kind of the power of this technique. It's based on the research of Deborah Mitchell, who found that imagining a future event, whether it's a success or a failure, as having already happened, helps us think through the consequences more clearly.
So instead of asking, what if this project fails, I should be asking, okay, this project failed. What were the factors that led to that?
Exactly. Think about how differently you'd approach, buying a used car if you imagined it breaking down on you a year from now,
Yeah.
That's the power of this technique.
Yeah.
It forces you to consider those potential downsides, those things you might otherwise overlook. And by approaching it from this it already happened angle, you can unlock a different part of your thinking and make more informed decisions in the present.
That's a really cool way to reframe things. I'm definitely going to try that one. What else does Venkataraman suggest?
Another practical tool she talks about is something called implementation intentions, which are basically like if-then plans.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those. Like, if I feel tempted to snack before dinner, then I'll drink a glass of water instead.
Exactly. It's a way of anticipating those moments of weakness and pre-planning your response, right?
Yeah.
Psychologist Peter Goldwitzer, he really pioneered this idea. And the research actually shows that these if-then plans are surprisingly effective. People who use them are way more likely to stick with their goals, whether it's, saving money or exercising regularly or breaking a bad habit.
So it's not enough to just have a goal. You need a plan for those inevitable moments when your willpower takes a nosedive.
Right.
I like it.
And what's even more fascinating is that Venkataraman doesn't just focus on these, individual strategies. She also looks at the role of our environment in changing our perception of time and patience.
Okay, this is where I'm getting a bit lost. How does our physical environment actually change our perception of time?
Well, think about it. Living in a constantly stimulating, fast-paced environment where you're bombarded with information and demands, it's like our internal clock speeds up to match that external pace. You feel perpetually time crunched, and it becomes so much harder to prioritize anything that doesn't offer immediate results.
That makes sense. It's like we're conditioned to crave that next dopamine hit, the next notification, the next quick win. No wonder we struggle with long-term thinking.
Right, exactly. And conversely, engaging in more meaningful activities, things that connect us to something larger than ourselves, that can actually make us feel like we have more time. Things like, volunteering, spending time in nature, even just focusing on one task at a time instead of multitasking.
It's like expanding your perception of time by filling it with experiences that matter. I never thought of it that way.
And this leads to a fascinating exploration of cultures and subcultures that promote a more far-sighted outlook.
Yeah.
For example, did you know that professional poker players have a surprising emphasis on delayed gratification?
Poker players. Seriously, I always picture them surrounded by flashing lights and instant wins.
Right. It seems counterintuitive. But think about the nature of the game. They have to be able to withstand those short-term losses, manage their emotions, and play the long game if they want to succeed, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's like they've created this little pocket of patience in the midst of all this chaos.
That's a great way to put it. It's like their profession trains them to think differently about time and rewards. Does she talk about any other examples?
She does. She contrasts the poker community with the Amish community, who have a strong focus on long-term sustainability, but for entirely different reasons.
Right.
Their values around simplicity, community, and respect for the land naturally encourage a perspective that extends beyond just the immediate. It's built into their way of life.
So it's like two completely different paths leading to the same outcome, a longer-term perspective. What I'm taking away from this is that, our thinking about time isn't fixed. It can be shaped by the environments and the cultures we create and participate in. That's really empowering.
It is. But it gets even more interesting. Ready to hear about how we can actually design our world to nudge us towards a more far-sighted perspective? We'll even meet a founding father and a revolutionary educational philosopher along the way.
Okay, hit me with it. We've talked about individual strategies and cultural influences, but what about the bigger picture? How do we design our world, our systems and institutions to encourage this long-term thinking?
Well, you're probably thinking, okay, this short-sightedness thing is a problem, but what can I actually do about it?
Right.
Well, get this. Venkataraman takes us all the way back to Ben Franklin for inspiration.
Okay.
You probably heard of Franklin's moral perfection quest, right?
Yeah, sure.
But what you might not know is that he actually designed a system to combat short-sightedness in decision-making. He called it moral algebra.
Moral algebra. That sounds pretty intense for a guy who loved his kite flying experiments. What's that all about?
It was basically a method for, weighing the pros and cons of a decision, but with a long-term twist. He'd list out all the potential benefits and drawbacks, but he'd also factor in how those factors might play out over time. It's like a cost-benefit analysis, but for your life choices. What's fascinating is that Franklin believed we could actually design systems to encourage virtuous behavior, even when faced with, those tempting short-term gains.
So it's not just about personal willpower, but about creating structures that nudge us towards better choices, even when those choices aren't, the most immediately rewarding ones. That's a pretty powerful idea.
Right. It makes you think about how we could apply that kind of thinking to everything from, how we design our cities to how our government policies are structured.
Yeah, no, that's a huge challenge for sure. But Venkataraman also brings it down to a more personal level with some really intriguing examples. She even delves into the world of education with Maria Montessori.
Yeah, Montessori education is fascinating in this context. It wasn't explicitly designed to cultivate long-term thinking.
Right.
But it does so almost by accident. It's all about fostering independence, patience, and a sense of time.
Now, I have to admit, my knowledge of Montessori education is pretty limited. What makes it so special?
Well, think about a typical preschool classroom. There are usually tons of supplies, enough crayons, blocks, and toys for every kid.
Right. That makes sense. Keeps things
right.
organized, avoids fights over the blue crayon.
Exactly. But here's the thing. In a Montessori classroom, they do things a little differently, at least for the younger children. Instead of having like a surplus of everything, they only have one of each item.
Wait, really? Only one set of blocks for the whole class? That sounds like a recipe for chaos.
It might seem that way, but it actually creates a really interesting dynamic. You see, since there's only one of each item, the kids naturally have to learn to wait their turn, to observe what others are doing, and to think about how their actions impact the group. It's like built-in patience training.
Wow. I never thought about it that way. So instead of just, grabbing whatever they want, they have to consider the needs of others and think about the long-term consequences of their actions. It's like a mini society with built-in foresight training.
Exactly. And some research even suggests that this early exposure to delayed gratification in a Montessori setting could actually foster longer-term thinking skills that benefit these kids throughout their lives.
It makes you wonder, if all kids learn this way, would we be less prone to those impulsive, short-term decisions as adults? It's a pretty radical idea, but I kind of love it.
It is a thought-provoking concept, for sure. But even if you didn't go to a Montessori school, there are still techniques you can use to train your foresight muscles. Venkataraman talks about something called premortem analysis. It was developed by psychologist Gary Klein.
Pre-mortem analysis, is that like analyzing something before it dies?
Not quite. It's more like analyzing a project as if it already failed. Imagine you're a team about to launch a new product. Instead of just focusing on how to make it successful, you start by imagining it's a year in the future and the product is completely flopped.
That sounds kind of depressing. Why would you want to dwell on failure before you even begin?
I know, it seems counterintuitive, but that's the genius of it. By forcing yourself to imagine that worst-case scenario, you're more likely to identify potential pitfalls and weaknesses that you might have overlooked in your excitement to get the project going.
So it's like a way of harnessing that perspective hindsight we talked about earlier, but in a group setting, you're basically turning anxiety about failure into a tool for success.
Exactly. And Venkataraman points out that premortem analysis is actually used in a lot of business settings to make more informed decisions, especially when it comes to, complex projects with lots of unknowns.
That makes sense. The higher the stakes, the more important it is to think through those potential downsides before you jump in head first. Any other cool techniques she talks about?
Well, this one might surprise you. She talks about the power of serious games to encourage long-term thinking.
Wait, games? Like video games? Are we talking about SimCity here?
SimCity is actually a great example, but serious games can take many forms. Board games, role-playing exercises, even virtual reality simulations. The key is that they're designed to be engaging and fun, while also prompting players to make decisions that have, long-term consequences.
So instead of just reading a dry report about climate change, you're actually playing a game where your choices impact the environment, the economy, and the well-being of future generations. I can see how that would be way more engaging and impactful.
Exactly. And Venkataraman highlights the work of Lawrence Susskind at MIT. He designs these kinds of games to help people understand complex issues like climate change, urban planning, even international conflict resolution.
It's like a way of making the future feel more real and immediate, which helps overcome that "it won't happen to me" barrier we talked about earlier. I love that. But it's not all theoretical, right? Does she give us any real-world examples of people who are actually putting this long-term thinking into action?
She does. And one of the most inspiring examples is the story of Wes Jackson, a plant geneticist who's dedicated his life to developing a solution to a problem you might not think about much: soil erosion.
Soil erosion. That doesn't sound very exciting.
I know it's not exactly a glamorous topic, but it's It's incredibly important. Healthy soil is the foundation of our entire food system.
Yeah.
And the way we currently farm with annual crops that require lots of tilling and chemicals, it's actually a major contributor to soil degradation. It's a classic example of short-term gain leading to long-term pain.
Okay, so what did this soil superhero do to fix it?
Well, for decades, he's been working on developing something called perennial grains. These are crops that, unlike annuals, don't have to be replanted every year. They have deep roots that hold the soil in place, reduce erosion, and require far fewer chemical inputs. It's a win-win for both the environment and the farmer.
That sounds pretty amazing. Why aren't we all eating perennial bread yet?
Well, here's where that long-term thinking challenge comes in again. Developing these new grains took decades of research, and convincing farmers to adopt a whole new way of doing things, that's a slow process. But here's the good news. Jackson's work is finally starting to gain some traction. He founded the Land Institute, and now big companies like Patagonia and even General Mills are getting involved.
Wow, that's huge. It's like his long-term vision is finally starting to pay off. But what about the world of finance? That seems like the ultimate breeding ground for short-termism.
It does, doesn't it? But Venkataraman has a surprising example from that world, too. She highlights a firm called Eagle Capital that has this radical approach. They focus on finding undervalued companies with long-term potential. They're not chasing those quick profits or following the latest trends. They're in it for the long haul.
That's an amazing story, but I wonder how replicable their strategy is. Can the average investor really ignore those short-term market swings and stick to a long-term plan?
It's definitely not easy, but their success shows that it is possible. One example Venkataraman gives is their investment in bank stocks after the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah.
Everyone was like panicking, selling off their shares. But Eagle Capital saw an opportunity. They believed that these banks, while facing challenges, still had strong fundamentals.
So they went against the grain, bet on the long-term recovery, and it paid off. That takes some serious guts and foresight.
It does, and it speaks to a larger trend that Venkataraman highlights, a growing movement within the business world to kind of push back against this obsession with short-term profits. There are organizations like Focusing Capital on the Long Term, made up of CEOs, investors, academics who are advocating for changes in how we measure corporate success and encourage a more far-sighted approach. It's like a recognition that short-term thinking isn't just bad for the planet and society. It's ultimately bad for business as well.
Okay, this is all making me feel a lot more optimistic. But there's one piece of this puzzle we haven't talked about yet. The legacy we leave for future generations. That's a whole other level of long-term thinking.
Ah, yes. That's where things get really, really thought-provoking and maybe a little uncomfortable. It's one thing to make decisions that affect our own lives, but how can we possibly make choices for people who haven't even been born yet? How can we even imagine what their world will be like?
Yeah, it feels almost impossible, doesn't it? Especially when we're already struggling to deal with the problems of today.
It's definitely a daunting task. But Venkataraman argues that it's not only possible, it's essential if we want to create a future worth inheriting. And she starts by grounding us in the reality of our current moment. This era where human activity is shaping the planet in unprecedented ways. Some scientists have even dubbed it the Anthropocene.
I've heard that term before. It basically means that we humans are now the dominant force on Earth, right?
Exactly. And that means our actions have consequences that will, ripple far beyond our own lifetimes. Think about climate change, deforestation, the depletion of natural resources. These are all problems that future generations will have to deal with. It's not just about leaving a positive legacy. It's about minimizing the harm we're causing and ensuring that future generations even have a habitable planet to inherit.
Okay, that's a pretty sobering thought. It makes this whole long-term thinking thing feel even more urgent. But how do we even begin to wrap our minds around such a huge responsibility?
Well, Venkataraman uses a really interesting analogy to illustrate the challenge of communicating with future generations. The Rosetta Stone.
I remember from history class. It was that stone slab with the same text carved in 3 different languages, right? It helped scholars decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Exactly. And she uses it to highlight the challenge of designing warning systems for nuclear waste repositories. These are sites where highly radioactive materials are stored underground, designed to remain isolated for thousands of years. But how do you warn future civilizations who might have completely different languages and cultures about the danger of these sites?
Wow. That's a tough one. It's like trying to send a message in a bottle across time, hoping someone will find it and understand it.
It is. And Venkataraman highlights the work of our archaeologist Juliet Kaplan. She's dedicated her career to designing these long-term warning systems. She and her team draw on insights from archaeology, linguistics, psychology, even art, to create messages that can withstand the test of time. They have to think about everything from the materials used to the symbols employed, knowing that their message might not be read for hundreds or even thousands of years.
It's like a giant multidimensional design problem with the fate of future generations hanging in the balance. That's a pretty heavy responsibility.
It is, and it brings up a really important ethical concept that Venkataraman explores in depth, intergenerational equity. It's the idea that we have a moral obligation to leave future generations with a fair share of resources and opportunities. Think of it like this. We wouldn't want to leave our kids a house with a leaky roof and a mountain of debt, right? Intergenerational equity is about making sure we don't leave future generations with a trashed planet and a mountain of unsolvable problems.
That's a powerful way to put it. It's like expanding our circle of responsibility to include not just our own children and grandchildren, but all the generations that will come after us. It's a humbling thought.
It is, and it leads to one of the most inspiring concepts in the book.
Right.
The idea of shared heirlooms. This isn't about, money or possessions. It's about the values, knowledge, and resources we pass down through generations. Venkataraman borrows this term from political scientist John Alexander, and it really reframes how we think about our legacy. It's about recognizing that clean air, clean water, a stable climate, a functioning democracy, these are all precious heirlooms that previous generations fought to preserve for us. And it's our responsibility to protect them for future generations.
It's like we're part of this long chain of humanity, and our actions today are shaping the links that will connect us to the future. That's a lot of pressure, but it's also incredibly inspiring.
It is. And here's where Venkataraman leaves us with a final thought-provoking question. If you were designing a message for future generations, what would you want them to know about the challenges and opportunities of our time?
Wow, that's a big one. It really makes you think about what truly matters, what we want to pass on, what kind of world we want to leave behind.
It does. And it's a question that I think is worth pondering, not just individually, but as a society.
Yeah.
What wisdom do we want to impart? What warnings do we want to issue? What hopes do we want to instill?
Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on this whole short-sightedness problem. And more importantly, I feel empowered to actually do something about it.
I'm so glad to hear that. And for anyone who wants to, explore these ideas further, I highly recommend picking up Bina Venkataraman's book, The Optimist's Telescope. It's a fascinating and hopeful read.
Absolutely. It's packed with insights, stories, and practical tools that can help us all become more far-sighted thinkers. Until next time, keep looking ahead.